Hi, this is Erin from the Winchester Public Library Reference Department, and I'm joining you today on a Facebook live stream that we're going to call All Booked. Welcome to our new Facebook stream, and we can't let you come to the library right now. I can't even go to the library right now, so we are trying to think of a bunch of different ways to bring the library to you. We're doing that through a bunch of online programming right now. And if you go to our website at winpublib.org, you'll see on the right-hand side a bunch of upcoming events. And when we finish our chat today, I'll go over some of the things that are coming up this week. We have a lot of fun things planned. It's been really hard to not get to the library. And the library is sort of a sacred place for all of us. We love being there. We love all that it has to offer, and it's been a struggle for staff, and I know it's been a struggle for patrons and people around town to not be able to get there. So we're doing what we can to make sure that you haven't forgotten about us and that you can find things that you want to read and find different ways to get to things that you want to read, and hopefully you've been able to borrow and download some things from Overdrive and Hoopla through the library's website. Music, videos, ebooks, audiobooks, there's all kinds of things on offer there, including the programming that I mentioned. So in this 30 minutes or so that I hope to spend with you every week called All Booked, I'd like to just drop in and chat about reading and how we're doing with our reading and what we can do to find books we're looking for and how to feel motivated to read in a time when we probably, even though we have maybe a bit more time on our hands these days, don't necessarily want to use those hands to pick up a book and settle into one because it's hard to pay attention and focus. A couple of weeks ago, Jenny, one of our reference librarians, adult and a children's librarian too, gave a talk about sort of how to get back into reading, and it was really helpful for me to listen to her talk about different ways to just kind of get back into things, including, reading short stories and being kind to ourselves and picking up a book we know we love. And she's going to talk again on Friday and on a Zoom, and I hope that some of you will drop into that as well. So in the coming weeks here, I'd like to talk to you for about 30 minutes a week. We're going to do this on Monday mornings. And I'd like to talk about all kinds of different topics related to reading, including specific genres or books that are backlisted and so are a bit easier to get from the library on Hoopla and Overdrive. And this week, we will chat about podcasts that are related to reading and literary news and publishing and all kinds of stuff like that. There are so many podcasts available now, and podcasts have been around for years and years. They're very easy to publish. They're cheap to publish, and it's hard to find a topic that hasn't been covered on podcasts. And in fact, while I was doing a little bit of research for this chat, I discovered that there are very, very specific kinds of podcasts related to books. Like if there's a book that you love that's pretty popular, Harry Potter fans, there's definitely something for you in the podcast world, and we'll get to that a little bit later. So there are excellent book podcasts that I thought I would introduce you to. I have a few of my favorites that I love, and I've discovered more that I love in investigating some for this list. So hopefully you'll find some new gems, ways to pass the time, and find another way to maybe figure out your next great read, or revisit books that you love, or find books by authors that you love, or dig deeper into a book that you're interested in reading or have read. I love to do that. I love to read a great book and then find some podcasts related to that book, maybe an author interview or something that digs into the story a little bit deeper, to get a bit of the backstory. If there was research involved, I like kind of researching nonfiction books, so I find podcasts are great for that. Podcasts are great for finding best of lists, best of 2019 or 2018. And sometimes if you just want a book that you know is going to be good, that was recommended widely by a large group of people, a best of list is a great way to go. So a good place to start, as I was saying, when you don't really know where to start, is a best of list. And listening to author interviews is also really fun, especially when you have several books by an author that you love. I love Margaret Atwood, and she is a great interviewee. She's always fantastic to listen to. She's got a really wonderful, funny, dry sense of humor, and she's Canadian like I am. So I find just her voice is almost comfort food to me. Sometimes I don't want to hear anything about a book until I'm finished reading it, so I avoid all articles and topics about books. But sometimes I just want to, hear a little something before I get started. So I'm going to talk about some podcast suggestions, and then I'm going to talk about ways that you can find podcasts. I'm going to talk about some specialty podcasts or genre-specific podcasts. And then I'm going to hope to do a recurring segment called What Are We Reading Right Now? And I'm going to ask a Winchester Public Library staff member to just give us a book that they're reading. Let us know maybe a little bit about what it's about. And I am going to be the first librarian today to give you the book that I'm reading. So my list of podcast suggestions for you as you get started in the world of podcasts is to start really general with big podcasts. One of my favorites is the New York Times Book Review podcast. It's very broad. If you've ever read the New York Times Book Review or know about the New York Times bestseller list, which is a great way to find a pretty decently sure thing of a read if you are into any kind of genre really, or they divide by nonfiction, fiction, paperback, hardback, ebooks as well. New York Times is great. They, the host, along with editors of the New York Times Book Review, talk to a lot of authors, cover a lot of current books and literary news, very like hot books, really covering what's popular. And I like to go back to this one after I've read a great book and listen to it. It's kind of one that I don't want to listen to too much ahead of time because I really try to avoid spoilers. And there are many, many episodes for you to go back. When you're starting to listen to a podcast, you certainly don't need to start a podcast on the day that that you've decided to listen to it. They're all archived. They all go right back to the beginning. The podcast interfaces have ways that you can search for a title or an author. You can browse them to see if there's something that interests you. You can start with a best of list. You can get to know the hosts this way, see if you like their banter or their style of speaking. Some will be hits, some are not so much. I have some podcasts I just don't like listening to because I just find the style is not for me. Another very popular podcast is called What Should I Read Next? It's been around for quite a while, a few years anyway. And the title alone tells you basically what the podcast is about. And it's a great one to come to when you are you've finished a really good book and you want to pick up another really good book. It's hard to finish a great book and move on to the next thing because you just want something you know is going to be as great. And this happens to me all the time. I'll finish a book that I just love, and I have a stack of books on my night table or my coffee table, and I pick them up, and they're all books that I want to read. They're all on my list of books to be read. None of them's just pulling me in. I have a game I play with myself sometimes of picking between 2 or 3 books. I read the first page of each, and whichever one makes me want to turn the page is the one I stick with. But even then, sometimes I just want one that I know is going to be great. So I'll turn to a podcast like this, and the woman that hosts it does a lot of author interviews, and she's looking again at sort of hot reads, but she also does themed things like what's great for summer, why do we love reading. She talks a lot about what is it about a book that draws us in, why some books have a special place for us, why some don't stick, why we think of summer reads in a different way than we think of the books that we read the rest of the year. We sort of have a special place for summer reads. She has a great summer reads list. Summer reads we sort of think of as being lighter and easier, and it's interesting because we all have different kind of time on our hands right now, but In the summer, you would think you have more time to dig into something meatier, but we don't necessarily want to focus on heavier stuff in the summer. And maybe right now we don't want to focus on heavier stuff at all. Another podcast is Backlisted. That's a great podcast to talk about books that have not been recently published. A lot of the big podcasts are talking about popular books that are popular right now. And those are great books, but they can be hard to come by in the library because there's either we're just getting them in, we don't have many copies, or there's a long wait list for them. So backlisted books are books that have been out for a while, and they tend to be more readily available on Hoopla and Overdrive. And we all have books that we haven't read from way, way back, or even want to reread. So Backlisted is a great podcast for that. Another podcast that broadly covers the general world again of publishing and book writing is the Guardian Books podcast from the UK. It's a great one. They had a recent episode in March 24th, I think it was, and it was about good books to read in isolation. A lot of the podcasts are doing that right now. You know, we're all sort of in the same boat, and reading for all of us has taken on a little bit of a different slant because we may be readers at heart who are having a hard time really like picking up a book. So there are maybe some books that might be better than others right now. Maybe we want to read pandemic books. Maybe we want to read something that is absolutely, completely not related to current events. But the Guardian Books podcast can help you find some great books. There is another really great podcast that I love. It's called So Many Damn Books, because that's exactly what there are in the world. There's just so many books. This is a fun one. These guys that host this podcast generally be hosting it while enjoying an adult beverage. They're very fun. They met through a comment section of an event called the Tournament of Books. And the Tournament of Books is an event that happens every year that is a book contest done in brackets like March Madness. So they typically start with 16 books done in bracket style, and the books are read and voted on, and the losers are kicked out of the bracket, and the bracket decreases until it comes down to 2 final books, and then the best book is selected. You don't have to read all 16. You can read some. You can vote on what you've read and loved, and it can also just be kind of a neat way to find a book. And they make it really fun. Their conversations are really funny. And so the Tournament of Books is just one thing that they do. They have a really fun episode also on literary adaptations. They talk about books that have been made into movies, which is a kind of a fun thing to do sometimes, is to read a book and watch a movie. It's hard to watch the movie and then go back and read the book, but even that can be fun because I did that with Sarah's Key. That's a movie that I watched before the book, but I knew once I saw the movie, I just had to go back and read the book. There are many books that make me want to go and watch a movie, and I think maybe this could be a good topic for us to talk about in the future. Rarely goes well. The movie is very rarely as good as the book, for obvious reasons. I mean, they're taking a meaty book and turning it into a 2-hour film. But there are some times when it works pretty well, and the vision of the movie director makes it work. There are 2 Book Riot podcasts. Book Riot is a website with just a ton of information on books and publishing again. And they have a podcast called Get Booked, and they also have a podcast called Book Riot, the podcast. Those are great general reading podcasts. There's a podcast called Overdue, and it's a fun one that talks about all the books that we always said we wanted to read, all those sort of classics, or they have a kids book section, and they talk about plays that were published, and it's like books like Gone with the Wind that maybe you've had on your list forever, or Atlas Shrugged that maybe you've had on your list forever. And it just reminds us that these books exist and talks about them a little bit, and might like stimulate a little bit of desire to pick up one of those maybe heavier, meatier books that have been you got to blow the dust off on your bookshelf and just kind of dig in. The Librarian is a great podcast. And of course, we can't leave librarians off the list of podcast hosts. The Librarian is a podcast that comes from the New York Public Library, hosted by Frank and Gwen for a long time. Gwen left in late last year, and the new co-host's name is Rhonda. So now it's Frank and Rhonda. They just started a new season in February, I think, of this year, in March maybe. They have great conversations about what they're reading. They're funny, talk about pop culture. They get in deep into books at times. They talk about book lists. They do a great best of. That's a fun one to go back and listen to, episodes from the archive. They do talk a little bit too about inside the library world, which is fun. It's fun for librarians. It's probably fun for library patrons as well. One of my favorite podcasts is called Just the Right Book. It's hosted by Roxanne Cody, who owns RJ Julia Booksellers in Connecticut. It's an independent bookstore, a very popular independent bookstore. And Roxanne has owned the bookstore for 30 years, and she's been doing the podcast for probably about maybe 10 or more, 13 or something like that. She's moved from doing general books. In the last year or so, she's focused more on nonfiction, or mainly on nonfiction books. She does author interviews, in-depth author interviews with she gets really big authors like Ta-Nehisi Coates and Hillary Clinton and Alice Hoffman. She does smaller books too, and she has a great style. She's very funny. The podcast also does the best of lists at the end of the year. They tend to, because they're a bookstore, they tend to be doing really big, more bestseller books, because they're really sort of trying to push the book selling side of it, but very smart conversations about books. Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books is another podcast that took me a long time to listen to, because I'm not crazy about the title of the podcast, although sometimes it's maybe true that moms don't have time to read books, but I think probably dads don't have time to read books, and also full-time employees don't have time to read books. I think many of us don't have time to read books. But this podcast was started by a woman who has 4 children. She talks a lot about how you pick what you want to read, and does a lot of author interviews. I recently listened to an interview with Delia Owens, who wrote Where the Crawdads Sing, and that was really an interesting insight into that book. I didn't know anything about the author at all. She was a sort of biology writer of nonfiction books, like a biologist, and she's funny, and it was a neat thing to listen to after reading the book. There is a podcast called By the Book, B-Y, By the Book, not By the Book, and the hosts of this show choose a different self-help book every week, and what they do is they read the book and they try to live their life by the prescribed so they try to live by the rules of the book and see how practical it is and how realistic it is. There are 2 Harry Potter podcasts that, for Harry Potter fans, I think this just sounds like a ton of fun. My son and I have read the first 4 books together now. He's 9, so we're sort of like, he's ready to take a break until book 5. The first one is called Mugglecast, the Harry Potter podcast, and talks about all things Harry Potter, including all of the books, and talks about the theme parks. It talks about the video games, like anything that has become Harry Potter focused. It talks about that. You might want to be careful if you're listening with your kids who have not finished reading the books, so that you don't get ahead and get any spoiler alerts. You might want to listen first. The other podcast related to Harry Potter is called Harry Potter and the Sacred Text. And it is like taking an English class, English literature class for Harry Potter fans. They go book by book, chapter by chapter, and talk about some of the bigger themes in the book and how they are related to our personal lives. Themes like devotion and commitment and revenge and forgiveness and love. And they have more serious literary conversations about these things. I don't know if kids would find that interesting. Older kids for sure would. Maybe not younger kids like my son. But if you just love Harry Potter and are someone who wants to just reread it all the time, it might be really fun to see the books again through the eyes of someone who's just sort of like analyzing the text a little bit more. There's also a podcast called The History of Westeros. And if you're a Game of Thrones fan, I probably don't have to tell you what that one's about, but very popular with the Game of Thrones people. There are other genres for podcasts like romance. There is a comic books podcast. Chilling Tales for Dark Nights talks about horror stories and horror books. And it's horror fiction read to you in spooky voices by voice actors with scary music. SFF Yeah is a podcast specifically for sci-fi and fantasy books. There is a podcast called Books and Boba, which is focused on books written by Asian and Asian American authors. There's a podcast called Reading Women, which focuses on books written by women. And there's a podcast called The Big Gay Fiction Podcast, which is focused on gay romance. So now we'll touch on places to listen to podcasts in case you don't know where you can find them. You can listen to podcasts on your mobile device, you can listen on your tablet, or you can listen right from your computer. If you Google the name of a podcast that you want to listen to, you'll generally be able to find a link to whatever platform the podcast uses. You'll find it on Apple or Stitcher or Google Podcasts, and you can just play the episode right from your computer. If you're using a mobile device, either an Android or an Apple mobile device, each of those comes with a podcast app. The Android will come with a Google Podcast app and Apple with an Apple Podcast app. And then you can go to the App Store and find a podcast app that may be a little bit more user-friendly for you. They're not all the same. They all essentially do the same thing. People have personal preferences. I use Overcast to listen to my podcasts, which is a multi-platform app, so you could use it on Google or on an Apple device, on Android or Apple. I like it because I can sort podcasts from oldest to newest, which I was unable to do using my Apple Podcast app, which is sometimes I don't want to keep reloading back to find the oldest ones. I just want to start with the oldest and move back to the newest. If you have an app you like that works for you, feel free to leave it in the comments and tell us why you like it. And another thing, if you're new to listening to podcasts, one thing you might want to do is look at the show notes of a podcast. The hosts of a podcast will also always include show notes for each episode. And in those show notes, they'll provide links to everything they've discussed in the podcast. So if you're listening and they mention a book and the book sounds interesting to you and you want to go back and find it, you don't have to re-listen to the podcast. They'll provide a link for you in the podcast show notes, and then you can just click on it and generally find anything that they've mentioned. So we're on to the segment, What Are We Reading? And the staff member I'm going to talk to today is me. I am reading The Farm, which if you were in the library, it's a novel by Joanne Ramos. And if you were in the library the month leading up to when we closed and you were in the reference department, you probably saw this book. And I'm going to read you the flap because I don't want to give too much away. I don't want to say a little bit too much and then give things away. So I'm going to read the flap and then we're going to close out for the week. Nestled in New York's Hudson Valley is a luxury retreat boasting every amenity. Organic meals, personal fitness trainers, daily massages, and all of it for free. In fact, you're paid big money to stay here, more than you've ever dreamed of. The catch? For 9 months, you can't leave the grounds, your movements are monitored, and you're cut off from your former life while you dedicate yourself to the task of producing the perfect baby for someone else. Jane, an immigrant from the Philippines, is in desperate search of a better future when she commits to being a host at Golden Oaks, or the farm, as residents call it. But now pregnant, fragile, consumed with worry for her family, Jane is determined to reconnect with her life outside. Yet she cannot leave the farm or she will lose the life-changing fees she will receive on the delivery of her child. Gripping, provocative, heartbreaking, The Farm pushes to the extremes our thinking on motherhood, money, and merit, and raises crucial questions about the trade-offs women will make to fortify their futures and the futures of those they love. It's good. I like it. It's interesting. It's freaky. It's one of those books that you read and you think this could never happen, and kind of like when we read The Handmaid's Tale, and you know, it's just one of those books and anything can happen, I think, is what we're all figuring out. All right, so thanks for joining me today on our Facebook page. You can take a look, leave some comments, give me some suggestions for any chats you'd like to have in the future. We're hoping to do Monday morning from 10 to 10:30 live streams. We will not meet next Monday. It's a holiday. I mean, it's a tip of the iceberg what I talked about today. There are so many podcasts to listen to, and sometimes when you find one, the bottom of the page, it will say, it's kind of like looking up books at the library. If you like this, then you might like this. And you can go on to a little bit of a, it's a rabbit hole of podcasts. Don't forget to go to winpublib.org to check out our online programming. Oh yeah, we've got some Zooms coming up, some tech Zooms, how to use Zoom, organizing digital photos, how to host Zoom meetings. There's a drop-in tech chat. We have our drop-in Talk About Books chat on Friday at 1 o'clock with Reference Librarian, who I think is going to be Jenny again. You'll want to catch that. It's really fun to talk about books. And at 5 o'clock on Friday is a virtual quarantine teenager scavenger hunt, quaranteenagers. That's an event you have to register for, so make sure you check that out on our webpage, winpublib.org. And a cooking class on Friday evening to make flatbreads, which sounds delicious. And since I'm not a teen, maybe I can go to the virtual cooking class, and that's another event that you'll need to register for. So I'm Erin. Thanks for joining me today. Keep reading. Bye.